Hi, I'm Kristi Arzola. I've been painting with watercolors for over 20 years and love sharing what I've learned with others. Thanks for being here, and I hope you paint along with me. These are the watercolor supplies I'll be using for today's painting. You're welcome to pause the video and refer to the video description for an exact list of these supplies. These are the paint colors I'll be using for today's floral. You are welcome to pause the video and refer to the video description for a list of these colors. Also in the video description is both a reference photo as well as a line drawing that you can download from free and print at home. If you don't know how to transfer your line drawing onto watercolor paper, please refer to the video in the upper right-hand corner. Once you've transferred your line drawing onto your watercolor paper, you're going to need masking fluid. This is the brand I currently use, and I'm going to apply this masking fluid just on the inside edge all the way around the exterior of my flower. In order to protect my paintbrush from my masking fluid, I'm going to use dish soap on the exterior of my paint bristles so that the masking fluid is less likely to bond to the bristles of my brush. Take a moment to pause the video here while you catch up and apply your masking fluid. You'll see that I've got at least 1/8 of an inch, almost 1/4 inch in some areas, all the way around the exterior of my flower. When it comes to the stem, sometimes filling the entire stem in with masking fluid is better than having too narrow of a margin. But once your masking fluid is applied and you allow it to dry completely, we can begin working on the background. So I'm going to use my number 10 round brush to move water over to my palette in several locations. I plan on having dark, vibrant colors in my background, but I'm going to include several different types of colors, so I want to have plenty of water on my palette. One of the first colors I'm going to use is a cadmium yellow. And I'm going to have a second cadmium yellow that I add a little bit of purple to give it more of a golden color. I'll also be using a little bit of burnt sienna. I'm making sure to add a lot of pigment to my water so that I have dark, vibrant colors. I always want to mix my colors to be 20% lighter than the value I want them to appear when it dries. I'm also going to be using some cerulean blue. I'll be using some Purple Lake. I didn't rinse the cerulean blue out of my brush, so it's kind of giving me more of a grape purple. But either way, I figure the colors will be mixed on the background here shortly. Now I do want to add a little bit of this Purple Lake to one of my yellows to give it more of this golden color. You could just use a yellow ochre if you want. It just won't be as translucent. And then lastly, I'm going to use some Payne's Gray. I'm a little concerned that I'm going to run out of my cerulean blue. So I'm just going to get a little bit more mixed up. If I need to go straight to my pigment during the painting process, I can. Okay, so these are the 6 colors I've mixed up for my background. I have a dark cerulean blue. I have a cadmium yellow. I have a cadmium yellow and Purple Lake mixture. I have a burnt sienna. Purple Lake. And my Payne's Gray. My Payne's Gray is not as dark as I would like, so I'm going to be adding more pigment. And that feels better. So go ahead and pause the video while you use the colors you have on hand to mix these up, and we will paint that background. Make sure you have clean water and apply a thick layer of clean water around the exterior of your flower. I'm just using a number 10 round brush to do this. As I tip my paper, you can see where I've applied the water. Where I had started, it's already begun to absorb into the paper, so it may require a second layer. But once I essentially get around the exterior of the flower, then I can switch to a larger flat brush to fill the rest of the background. I tend to just like to use a smaller paintbrush when I'm wetting the area closest to my subject, just so I don't accidentally go too wide. So I like to tip my head at an angle so I can kind of give my paper a side glance to ensure I haven't missed any areas with my water. And I like to let this water kind of sit and settle in for about 30 seconds before I begin adding my color. You don't want to have a bunch of standing puddles of water because unfortunately all that excess water will simply dilute those vibrant colors you took the time to mix up, and you will have a really washed out background. So if you want the vibrancy, you just want to keep moving the already present water around your paper and allow it to settle into the fibers and kind of thin out a little bit. So we're basically watching the sheen of our paper. The real narrow areas that don't have a lot of surface area are going to be some of the first ones to dry. So be mindful of those because those are also going to be the first ones you want to paint. Now we are going to have a light source coming in from the upper left-hand corner. So we want to make sure to maintain just clean water in that upper left-hand corner so it kind of looks like sun rays. Now, once you have that perfect sheen on your paper and you are without puddles, now it's time to move quickly and get our paint color in. So I'm going to start with my yellows because I don't want them to get dull or dirtied up. And if I apply my yellows first, it will kind of be a visual reminder to keep that upper left-hand corner bright and light. I'm trying my best not to accidentally hit my flower. When I get close to the flower, I really slow down. I know we got to get this color in before it starts drying, but I do not want to hit my flower. I'm now going to use that golden yellow where I've added that purple lake. I'm just kind of dragging this color through so it might resemble some sun rays. And you can drag them through in both directions. Really slow down when you get close to that flower so you don't bump into it. Now before I walk away from this corner, I'm going to rinse the paint out of my brush. I'm going to dry it off incredibly well so I can use this nearly dry brush to kind of absorb some of the paint, creating some sun rays out of this upper left-hand corner. You could also use a paper towel if you have it handy. But once you're happy with the way your rays are looking in that left-hand corner, just give it some space and move on to other areas. So I'm now going to use that cerulean blue . Now I don't want any greens intentionally in the background, So I'm going to avoid allowing my blues to run in with my yellows if I can manage it. So be mindful of those yellows. Stay away from them with your blues. I'm now going to get some of that purple lake. I don't mind my purple lake running into those yellows because they'll just make a beautiful kind of golden orange color. So that kind of acts as a wonderful choice for going between your blues and yellows. Don't move your paintbrush too fast or you will risk splattering some of your paint colors on your white flower. So just be mindful of your pace. Although we need to get these colors in, you don't want to splatter things. If you're starting to lose the sheen on your paper and you feel like, oh no, I need more working time, then use a really fine water mister from a distance and spritz your painting. Keep it very mild, and that will give you additional working time. Just keep in mind, every time you mist your paper, sadly, it will dilute your colors. So don't go too heavy-handed. I'm going to now clean my brush and use a clean, practically dry brush just to move some of this color around in the background. I can use some of this golden yellow that we had that purple lake added to. And as long as I still have a nice golden color, I can come in here and add a little bit more vibrancy to some of my rays. I'm now going to grab some of that burnt sienna, and I'm making sure to be mindful of the sheen of my paper. If I do not have any sheen, I need to stay out of those areas because they're already beginning to dry. I'm pulling to my light source and then lifting up and away from the paper as I near it. Being very mindful that this area is already beginning to dry, so I'm not getting too close. Now, before things really truly dry, I'm going to try and get some darker saturation here in my background. So I'm taking this Payne's Gray to a few areas that still have a nice gloss to them, so I can add a little bit more of a dramatic color. Move very slow with this dark color. Don't risk splattering your flower. Now, once you kind of have this Payne's Gray down, don't leave it looking like polka dots. That's not our end goal. So rinse your brush, dry it off so you don't create blooms, and then move that gray around on the damp surface and blend it with the surrounding colors. And change your shapes. Give variation in your shapes and sizes. If you've got some really cool, unexpected textures occurring and you like them, then don't blend them away. Just keep them and move over to a new area. I'm just rinsing my brush and drying it off. I'm going to grab a little bit of that cerulean blue. And I feel like I'm happy with the way the background is looking right now. The more I fiddle and play with it, the more I risk having blooms. Because right now, when we look at my paper from a side angle, there's not much gloss left in the appearance of my paper. And that's a visual cue that I need to now be hands off, let it be whatever it is now. If I need to refine things, I can consider a second layer, but I think I'm happy with this. So I'm going to let this dry completely. If I'm impatient, I'll hit it with a blow dryer, and then we can remove the masking fluid. To remove my masking fluid, I often use a rubber cement pickup. And you'll find that when you're removing the masking fluid, if there are any pencil lines beneath it, it is often going to erase those pencil lines. So there may be some pencil lines you need to redraw. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Once you've made sure that all of your pencil lines are back where you want them, we're going to begin mixing paint colors for the lightest values in our flower. So we're going to be focusing on those white petals. In some areas of my flower, I do want some soft yellows, so I'm simply going to water down the yellow I've used in the background. I'm also going to water down the blue I used in the background because there are some soft blues I want. Now, if you are having a hard time deciphering what colors your eyes are seeing in the petals, I find it helpful to print out your reference photo, get a scrap piece of watercolor paper, punch holes in it, and then anywhere on your reference photo where you're trying to match colors, simply put your scrap piece of paper there. You can mix a paint color, try to get close, and you can test it out next to the hole, and that's going to help you determine whether or not you need to adjust your paint color. So a scrap piece of white paper with some holes in it will really help you with your reference photo once it's printed out. So meanwhile, I have watered down my yellow to use in some areas of my flower. I've also watered down my golden yellow where I've added the purple to it. I also have a blue, which is not quite as dark as I need it. Because remember, we always want our colors to be a little darker than our intention, so when they dry, they're not too washed out. So I have a lot of the similar colors to my background. I've just basically diluted the majority of them so they're a lighter value. That black I will not be using on the petals. Too dark, so I need to add more water. Still a little too dark, but I'm going to go ahead and begin with the first petal. So right now, the center of our flower is going to be darker than most of the other values in the rest of our flower. So we're not going to be getting any water on it. If there's any dark pencil lines on the drawing of our flower, we need to lighten those up using a kneaded eraser. It's really easy for pencil lines to show through thin, translucent watercolors on a white subject. So don't lighten everything up at once. Just kind of find the edges of the one petal you're going to start with and just start with lightening those lines. So I'm going to start with this petal here first. I'm going to apply clean water. I'm going to do my best not to hit the center of the flower. If you wanted to, you could mask the center. Now the first layer of water is going to get absorbed into your paper rather quickly. So take your time with your water and really resaturate and reapply if necessary. Once you feel like the water is at the right level, it's staying damp and not drying or absorbing into the paper too quickly, then you can start adding your paint colors. So the areas of the flower where I want some bright whites remaining in the petal, I'm just going to avoid that area with my paintbrush. So I am going to be getting the really watered down burnt sienna. Notice how when I move my paintbrush over the wet surface, I try to do so in one stroke, just so I can have a better control over my shape. So if I want a shape that is curving towards center, I'll go to the outside edge, curve to center, and won't pick up my brush until that shape is created. And then I'll fill it in. As I get close to the center, I'll just take my time around those edges. Once I get to that far left edge, I'm going to remove the paint from my brush. I'm going to get some of that cerulean blue. And I want you to take note that I am not going back into areas where I was previously at on this petal, fiddling, because I know in some areas it's already beginning to dry. So I'm just staying out of it. Any additional details or darker values can be achieved on a second pass. So before I consider this first layer done, I need to soak up any puddles. The next flower petal I'm going to paint is the upper right hand corner. I'm going to make sure to use my kneaded eraser to soften any pencil lines that may be along that petal. I'm going to use clean water. I'm reapplying my water in areas where the water is absorbing into the paper very quickly, just to resaturate. And although this particular petal has a forward fold on the right-hand side, that is something I will accomplish on a second layer. So for now, I'm just sticking with the back edge of the petal. All right, I'm going to get some of that cerulean blue. And I want to add a little bit of the Payne's gray to it, so it's a little on the more neutral side. Taking my time around the center details. Now with this fold on the right hand side, I don't want these paint colors to creep too far to the right. So I'm using a clean, very dry brush because I dried it off on my sponge. And I'm pressing down with firm pressure along that fold edge just to soak up some of that paint so that those blue grays kind of stay in their zone. Now up towards the midway on this flower, I'm going to use that golden yellow where we added the purple to our yellow. And I'm going to add a little bit of this color through the center. I can dry my brush off and use a clean dry brush to kind of feather that transition between the two colors so it's a little bit more natural and gradual. And I'm continuing to kind of keep those blue grays out of that forward fold with the use of a dry brush and pressing down firmly. Now I'm not going to fiddle any more with this petal because some parts of it are already beginning to dry. This is just layer one. So I'm going to now find another petal that isn't in contact with either of the two that are still drying. I'm going to use my kneaded eraser to lighten those pencil lines. Make sure they're nice and soft. I'm going to add clean water to the petal. I'm tapping my brush to help it release some of the water it's holding, just to saturate some of the areas that are a little more thin. I'm going to use my number 6 round brush. I'm grabbing that golden yellow, and through the center of this petal, being mindful of the petal that is in front and trying not to hit it. I'm going to add some of that golden yellow through the center. Rinse and dry my brush off. Using my dry brush, I press down with firm pressure to pick up the paint and make sure to pull it out of some of the areas where I want to remain bright white. Then on this lower bottom edge of this same petal, I'm going to use that watered down cerulean blue. I can get a little bit of that watered down Payne's gray just to darken up this bottom right corner using a clean, nearly dry brush, so very mildly damp, to kind of help with my blends. Anytime I'm about to walk away from a petal or part of my painting, I like to go through and just clean up any edges with my paintbrush by tracing the edge with my brush. But elements of that particular petal are already drying, so I need to move on. I'm going to hop down to this forward petal on the bottom right, making sure pencil lines are nice and soft, light value. I'm going to keep the water just inside the petal, and I'm not going to apply the water on that forward fold. So the water is only going on part of this petal because I want to maintain some bright white highlights. Sometimes when I get to smaller shapes, I find it's difficult to stay inside a zone or to see where I'm at. So I'll switch to my small number 2 round brush, and I'm using that Payne's gray. And I'm going to fill this whole area in. Towards the flower where this petal connects, I'm going to add a little bit of Purple Lake on top of these wet grays, just to get a little color in this petal. I can add some of the golden yellows if I'd like to parts of the gray for a little bit more help in the shadow. But before I walk away, I'm just going to make sure to clean up this edge so it has a nice, neat appearance when it dries. Now I'm going to go to this back petal here, and I checked in on the petals I painted on either side, and they're still slightly damp. So it's too much of a risk to paint it at this moment, so I need to hit it with the blow dryer. Now that both those flowers are completely dry, I can apply some clean water to the petal between. Notice how I don't force myself to bring that clean water right up to the pencil edge. I stay just a little bit away from it because it can be difficult to see where that clear water is being applied. And I'd rather be a little short from my end goal. And when I get paint on my brush, it'll be easier for me to see where to put it. I'm going to get a little bit of that golden yellow on my brush. I'm going to add some of that color through the center. I'm going to really slow down when I get close to the center details. I'm going to continue with that golden yellow up against that right edge. I'm going to get some of that Payne's Gray and add a little blue to it. And in this bottom right corner of this petal, I'm going to add some soft blues. I'm taking my time around the edges, trying to minimize overlap. I'm using that soft Payne's Gray with a little bit of blue just to create a shadow through the center. And I'm using a clean, practically dry brush to kind of blend these colors on the wet surface. If I need to pick up paint color to remove it from an area or to stop it from traveling into an area, I simply dry my brush off really well on my sponge and then press with firm pressure to soak it up. While that petal's drying, I'm going to hop over to this petal on the far left. I'm going to lighten up those pencil lines on that forward fold. Clean water first. I'm going to get that golden yellow again. Staying towards the bottom half. I'm not worried about establishing those dark grades on the forward fold. That'll come later. Once I get closer to the center of the flower, I'm going to add a little bit of that watered down burnt sienna. I really take my time on those edges. And I'm going to let this dry completely, and I'll do that fold on a second layer. I'm going to hop over to this far right petal. Adding clean water. I'm going to get some of those golden yellows for this left half of this petal. I want to keep the color out of this bottom half, so I'm using a clean, dry brush to control how far that paint color travels. Once I get closer to this corner, this thin, narrow space here, I'm going to get that blue-gray on my brush. And I'm just dragging my brush through that wet yellow using that blue-gray. Cleaning and drying my brush so I can use this practically clean, dry brush to kind of blend these edges the way I want. I am going to add just the tiniest bit of purple to the very, very narrow inside point of this petal. But I want to make sure it is watered down so it's not too vibrant. Now I'm going to give this petal some space, and I'm going to hop over to this far left petal, checking in on the others, making sure they're dry. If they're not dry, I need to hit them with a blow dryer. Going to use that kneaded eraser to lighten any pencil marks that I feel like might be too obvious. Clean water first. Once I have water on the petal, I'm going to get some of that golden yellow, keeping it towards the bottom half. I want the upper edge to be pretty bright white. I'm going to switch to my small number 2 round and get some of that darker Payne's gray. Still going to be watered down a bit. Added a little blue to it, and I'm going to stay to this left edge here. When I get to the base of the flower, I'm going to add just the smallest amount of Purple Lake. And before I walk away and let this first layer dry, I just need to make sure that my edges are nice and neat. So I'm just taking a mildly damp brush, going around my outside edges. Now I need to hit this with the blow dryer once more so I can paint that last petal and then start my glazing. I'm going to use my large brush, add clean water, If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to switch to my number 6 round. I'm going to get some of that golden yellow. I'm now going to get some of that cerulean blue. Trying to keep that top edge nice and bright with just clean water so it maintains whites. I'm going to get some of that blue-gray. As I get closer to the base of my flower, I'm going to use a little bit of Purple Lake right at the base. So right on top of that gray, I'm going to add a little bit of that purple. I'll rinse my brush and dry it off on my sponge real well. And it's with that practically dry brush that'll help blend those purples in with the grays on the wet surface of my paper. Now I'm going to hit that petal with the dryer and we'll start glazing. Now we are going to refine our shadows and some of the petal folds by glazing. So glazing is essentially when you work with a very diluted color and it's pretty much the consistency of tea, and you add some just real subtle changes to the color of your petals. So right now I'm just adding a very thin amount of water to the forward fold of this petal. I'm going to get that really watered down cerulean blue. I'm going to do a glaze using a light touch, going right onto my petals fold. As I get lower on the fold, I'm going to switch to just clean water. I can add a little bit of that watered down blue-gray on the left edge. I'm just using a clean, practically dry brush to help control the blend of my paint on the paper. While that fold is drying, I'm going to give it some space. I'm going to use a really watered down gray color. I don't want it to be too dark. I want to really make sure I load my brush with enough of it so that I don't run out of paint halfway through. I'm going to go to this center petal. I'm going to start at the center end to create a line down the center. And I'm essentially going to just create a glaze to indicate a stronger shadow right onto the dry paper. As I get about halfway down on this petal, I'm going to be switching to water just so this shadow color brightens up and becomes lighter as we move down to the base of the flower. You don't want to allow puddling because that'll kick back into your glaze that is already beginning to dry. I accidentally smeared with my hand this first glaze. So I'm just using a clean damp brush to kind of soak a little bit of that up. I'm going to get that golden yellow, load my brush with it so I have enough. I'm going to come to the right side of this next petal. I'm going to do just a real subtle glaze. I'm going to really load my brush with that same golden yellow so I can continue with the glaze on the left edge. I essentially start at one end, try to move with confidence to the opposite side, and then I avoid going back into my paint stroke because I know things have already begun to dry. I'm going to give that petal some space. I'm going to capture the forward fold on this next petal using that really light gray. I am going to make sure there's a little bit of blue in it. Again, working with the consistency of tea, and I load my brush up really well with the glaze so that my brush doesn't run out halfway through the paint stroke. I'm going to use this same color to establish a glaze on this next petal. As I get down towards the center, I'm going to rinse my brush, lightly tap my sponge so it is only mildly damp. I'm going to use this damp brush to kind of pull the end of that color so it kind of disappears and blends with the rest of the petal. I'm going to return to that blue-gray color, and I'm going to do a larger glaze on this forward petal. I need to move quickly and confidently, so really take a moment to note where you want to start and end with your glaze. Load your brush up with plenty of paint so it doesn't run out halfway. And before things dry, finish that glaze. Quality brushes should hold quite a bit of paint, allowing you to fill in a large space without having to re-dip too many times. I'm going to go to the forward fold of this petal on the bottom right. I want to maintain just a thin white edge. I'm adding a little bit of water in here. I'm going to use that blue-gray. If it's not darker than the shading, In the center of the petal, we need to add more pigment to our mixture. It should be just a little darker. Puddles make it difficult to control where you're going, so soak up excess puddling. Allow that thin space of white and just let that dry. I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer before I proceed with my glazing. I'm continuing with my blue-gray. I want to really make sure it's not too dark. A little bit goes a long ways. I'm going to come into this far right petal. Just hugging the very end of it. Now the very end of this particular glaze, I want to have some texture so it kind of reads like the texture of the petal. And again, we want to get this glaze in before things dry too quickly. So sometimes before you do a glaze, it's very beneficial to just pause and study your reference photo, get an idea of your angles before you go in with your glaze. That way you're feeling a little bit more confident with the shape you're creating. I'm going to rinse that color out of my brush and dry it off. And with this clean, practically dry brush, I'm going to finish off the glaze by just kind of softening some of these last edges. But you can only really do this with a very mildly damp brush. If you have too much color in your brush, it's going to come across a little too harsh. I'm going to continue with this same glaze color on this forward edge of this flower. I want this to get a little darker as we get closer to the base. And I don't allow there to be any puddling. I'm going to move on to this next petal. I want to make sure this is a nice and light blue-gray, nothing too dark. I'm going to be mindful of where I rest my hand so I don't smear anything. I'm going to add some of this blue-gray closest to the center of the flower. As I get close to the fold on the right-hand side, I want to darken up my color just a smidge. I just want to ensure that this color is darker than the value of the forward fold. So if you need to add just a little bit more pigment in here and mix on the wet surface to ensure you get that contrast, you can do that. With glazing, you can't really take too much time with it because you need to get it in before things begin to dry. And this glaze happens to get lighter as it moves towards the left edge, so I'm just bringing in a little bit of water on my brush so I can dilute the color as I pull it to that left side. And I want to go just past the intersection point where these two petals kind of cross, and then I'm going to kick that shadow over to the right. I'm going to give that petal some space. I'm going to hop down to this lower left petal. This is a shadow that begins, or a glaze that begins quite dark, lightens as it comes to the right, and kind of changes color as it nears the center. So we're going to be mixing multiple colors. So I'm going to start off with just this real subtle blue-gray. As we get closer to the base of the flower, I will add just a little bit more purple lake into my glaze. I'm going to add also a little bit of that burnt sienna. Now, as I continue with this glaze, I'm going to keep it with that lighter blue-gray. But I got to get it in before things begin to dry. I try not to overload my brush with excess paint because I don't want it to kick back into my glaze and create blooms. So be mindful of how much you're loading your brush. A little bit less is going to help you out. And that might turn into a bloom there, but it is what it is. I'm adding just a little bit of that burnt sienna to the end of this glaze before it dries. I'm going to continue with this really light blue gray mixture coming into this bottom right petal just to darken up a little bit of the front. I'm going to use this same blue-gray to darken up just a little bit of the end of this fold, but I'll switch back to clear water to allow it to blend with the rest of the fold. So I'm just adjusting my values with small little tweaks. I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so I can begin with the center of the flower. Now the center of this flower has all kinds of different colors, but we're going to start off with the lightest values. So I need one color that is just a really soft, kind of muted mauve. So I'm going to use just a little bit of the permanent rose pink. And I'm going to add a little bit of that sap green to it, so it doesn't look as bright. And I'm going to really water this down so it's not too vibrant. So this is a little too dark for what I want it for, but because we're going to have water on the surface, it should brighten up a bit. The other color I want is a yellow, but I need to dull this yellow. I can't have it be, really, really bright because it's kind of in shadow. So I need to make sure to add just a little bit of purple to it. So I'm using that purple lake to make more of that golden yellow, very similar to what we did in the background. And that's going to be the color we're going to use. So I'm just going to start at the top, and I'm just doing the first layer of color through the center here. Once I get about halfway down, I'm going to be rinsing my brush and getting that mauve color. I'm trying to move relatively quickly so it doesn't dry too fast. I really slow down when I get to the edges. I try not to be sloppy. And as I get closer to the center, I'm going to switch to just some water. That way the center color is lighter. Cleaning up the outside edges so I can hit it with the blow dryer. For the very center of the flower, since it's a more complex shape, I highly encourage you to pause the video, grab a pencil, and re-sketch some of the darkest shadows you can see in the reference photo to help you and to ensure you don't get lost. So if you need to, pause the video, get a moment to get your pencil sketch in order, and then we're going to use a number 2 round brush with a darker Payne's Gray to establish some of these shadows. So I'm just going to come in and essentially trace some of the pencil lines where I know I have some of the darkest shadows in the center of this flower. I'm not focused on the, soft grays. I'm really focused on just the darkest colors I can see in the center so I can at least figure out where those are at. So I'm just painting wet on dry, keeping my pressure very light, holding my brush vertical so I have better control. And I'm keeping my line work nice and narrow with my brush. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm now going to rinse my brush and I'm going to switch to that mauve color. And at the base of some of these shapes, I'm going to apply that mauve color. Once you get to some of these outer shapes, you can use the mauve to kind of basically redraw some of your pencil lines so you have at least a little bit of clarity there. Once you've done that, you're going to rinse your brush. You're going to get some of that yellow. And you're going to add just a little bit of Payne's Gray to it. So it's more of an olive green, I would say. And we're going to use this color to give a little bit of shadow to the base of the upper half. You can also use this green to kind of retrace some of the shapes that you see in the center. I'm now going to return to my mauve pink. I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's Gray to it, so it's more of a shadow color. I'm going to use this to kind of push the shadows on the outer edge, so there's better contrast. You can also use this at some of the base of your shapes, so the shadows are a little bit more gradual. I'm continuing with that kind of grayed out mauve just to add some shadows. Now I need to refocus and give some of my attention to the stem. So I'm going to mix up some darker browns. I'm going to be adding quite a bit of purple to my brown though. So since I have an existing Purple Lake mixture on my paint palette, I'm just going to add some burnt umber to it to give it more of a brown tone. Now this might feel a little surprising, but I'm going to come in and use a light blue on the upper half of the stem. If any of my blue is starting to dry, I'm going to add a little bit of water. I want this blue to stay wet long enough for me to layer some browns on top. But while this is damp, I'm going to add a little bit of that golden yellow that I added some purple to on the lower half of the stem. And I know right now this seems kind of wonky, but I do have a plan. I think oftentimes the stem is an area of a flower that is overlooked and not given the attention it deserves. So taking some steps to really make your stem look cool and finished is important in my opinion. So now that the stem is completely wet with some blues and yellows, I'm now going to use some of those dark purple browns that I mixed up with the burnt umber. And I'm going to give some color down through the center of the stem by kind of tapping my brush, embracing the blooms, and letting that irregular edge happen. Now this is just layer 1 of the stem. I am going to have to dry it. So I'm going to hit this stem with the blow dryer before doing details and textures on top. Now I'm going to be using my Payne's Gray to start creating some definition on this stem. So this Payne's Gray isn't super dark, okay? So I'm going to use it to kind of create some textures that follow the contour of the stem. I'm being okay with dotting my line work and creating little irregular dashes in my line work. And I'm kind of creating this wraparound bark texture on the branch here. I don't want my branch texture to be in a pattern with even spacing. So I'm being mindful of that as I add my details into the branch. I can grab some of that brown and purple mixture to push the values of the stem textures. And I want the back side of the stem to have some darker, deeper tones for good contrast. So I'm not necessarily just filling the stem in. I'm continuing to follow the contour, creating some irregular dashed lines for textures. I'm making sure to really push the values of the shadows underneath some of these flower elements at the base. I need to add at least some color to these small sections of petals that I haven't covered. So I'm going to use a little bit of a blue-gray with some added burnt sienna, so it's a little bit more of a warmer gray. Painting wet on dry, just to capture this small little petal fold. Now that I've painted the majority of the elements, there may be some areas where you want a little bit more brighter color. So sometimes I like to incorporate a bleed-proof white or a white titanium gouache, something that is opaque that I have the freedom to tint with. But I like using this because I can kind of add some finishing details that I wouldn't otherwise be able to get. So I've got this bleed-proof white on my palette. I'm going to tint it with a little bit of that mauve color. I do want it to be leaning towards the white, so not too dark. And I can come in to the center of the flower here, and I can choose to make some of these details pop forward more. So I'm just finding those brightest areas. And I'm keeping this more to the center. I won't be going all the way to the outside edge. I can also tint some of this color with more of that golden yellow. And I don't want it to be too dark, so if I need to add more white, I can, because this isn't going to brighten things up the way I want. So I'm just going to add more of that bleed-proof white to my mixture, so it's a lighter color. And I can just brighten up parts of the center here. So now that I've essentially brightened up the very center of the flower, I have the optional choice of using straight bright white to brighten up just parts of some of the petals or edges of the petals. So for example, this forward edge here on these front two petals, if I feel like they're not bright enough, I can come in here and add just this thin little sliver of white to brighten them up. I can do the same thing on this opposite petal. I can also go to the back edge of some of these petals and add just a little thin white to brighten them up. When you load your brush with your white paint, really make sure that you're wiping away the excess so you can bring your paintbrush to a nice narrow point before going to your painting. You can tint some of your bright white using a yellow. And if you'd like to add just a little bit of a glow on the back edge of parts of your stem, you can add that. But at this stage, you can really push the details, values, and contrast as far as you'd like. I hope you learned a ton and you enjoyed the results of this piece. I'd love to see it. Send me a message if you did finish it. And we hope to see you next week. If you've been enjoying my watercolor tutorials and would like to support the channel, consider buying me a cup of coffee or a tube of watercolor paint. A $5 Venmo contribution is always appreciated, but never expected. Your support helps make future tutorials possible.